Hi there, this is Colin McGarry walking D-Day, and today we're on to journalists. Now those of us who are passionate about following D-Day, the Battle of Normandy, we depend on eyewitness accounts from civilians and veterans, and also work done by historians. But imagine if all we had was text like this, it'd be pretty difficult to digest. So the actions of these men that came into Normandy were brought to life by cameramen and photographers. They were in the thick of the fighting, armed with just a camera or a still camera or just a microphone. Now the cine cameras they had, I say cine because video didn't exist then, they had a reel of film with 1 minute 20 seconds on it. Can you imagine how selective you've got to be in those conditions? Because today we just film everything and then cut out the unimportant stuff. The British forces had 10 Army Film Photographic Units, AFPU, assigned to the forces on D-Day. For the Americans, there were 3 units of the 165th Signals Company. We're going to concentrate on the journalists working for the media. Around 558 reporters, cameramen and photographers were given accreditation to cover D-Day. The BBC assigned 48 journalists. There was Chester Wilmot in a glider.
This is Chester Wilmot broadcasting from a glider bound for France and invasion. The men who are sitting on the benches in the back of the glider are no doubt wondering whether the parachutists have succeeded in seizing the ground on which we're going to land. But if they're worried about it, they give no signs of it.
There was Richard Dimbleby with the RAF. Both his sons became famous broadcasters afterwards.
2 hours ago, I was looking at Caen Cathedral, standing up grey and soft in the light of the sun. We were flying into France at 200 miles an hour to attack an important concentration of German tanks of the 21st Panzer Division gathered in the path of the Allied armies advancing beneath us.
Robert Dunet with the US troops. The first US correspondent to give an eyewitness account of D-Day was NBC's Wright Bryan. He flew in a C-47 with Lt Col Cole of the Cabbage Patch fame. One of the men in the plane told him that he knew his parachute was okay because his mum had folded it. She worked in the parachute folding unit. As soon as the plane touched down back in England, he was whisked away by a jeep to 55 miles to London. At 9:32, John Snagge read out the announcement from Eisenhower about the invasion.
This is London, and this is John Snagge speaking. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, have just issued Communique Number 1 under the command of General Eisenhower. Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
In another room, Bryant was writing out 10 pages to cover what he'd witnessed. 45 minutes later, he was reading it into a microphone. The first journalist on the ground must be Leonard Mosley. He worked for the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Sketch. Just after 1 o'clock, he floated to the ground on a parachute with a typewriter strapped to his chest. When he's on the ground, he moved towards the coast. His report reads, "As dawn came, I moved across the country through Nazi patrols to get nearer to the coast. Wherever we moved, there were traces of our airborne invasion. There were parachutes lying everywhere. There was an earth-shaking holocaust of noise. Approaching the coast under cover of naval ships, the invasion barges were coming in and coming in firing. It was a terrific barrage that must have paralysed the defences. Then ships began nudging towards the beaches, and we shook each other's hands in the knowledge that the invasion, at long last, had begun." In fact, the first journalistic communications about D-Day came from the German organisation Transocean. At 8:32 Greenwich Mean Time, they made a report about the invasion, so scooping the Allied journalists. Former newspaper reporter and BBC journalist Robert Barre, he followed Eisenhower from D-Day to the end of the Battle of Normandy. He was there when Eisenhower was with the paratroopers taking off. Barre wrote, "Their faces were darkened with cocoa, sheaths and knives were strapped to their ankles, Tommy guns strapped to their waists, bandoliers and hand grenades, collars of rope, pick handles, spades, rubber dinghies hung around them, and a few personal oddments, like the lad who was taking a newspaper to read on the plane." Barre said there was an air of confidence among the paratroopers, as if they'd done this many times. This was, in fact, their first combat flight, or combat drop. LCIL 88 was heading to Fox Green on Omaha Beach. His mission was to deposit demolition men to break through the obstacles leading up to the beach. LCIL means Landing Craft Infantry Large. On board the landing craft was Abbot Joseph Leibling, known as AJ to his readers. He wrote in the New Yorker magazine. He was to stay on the landing craft, not go on the beach. The landing craft was at the beach for 4 minutes before it started retreating. They'd been hit by a 75mm gun, so they had wounded men, and the landing craft liaised with a hospital ship to pass the wounded men onto it. Leibling wrote that there was an unknown Coast Guardsman helping to guide a stretcher onto the boat. He got a whole sleeve full of blood from the wounded man. Many years later, Leibling admitted that it was actually him who was helping the wounded man and who got a sleeve full of blood. But when he wrote the report, he thought his readers wouldn't believe it if he said it was him. John Snagge of the BBC introduced Howard Marshall, who just a few minutes earlier had stepped off a landing craft. He spent the day with the men taking notes so he could report what he'd seen to their loved ones back home. But he said, "I've just come back from the beaches, and as I've been in the sea twice, I'm sitting in my soaked clothes with no notes at all. All my notes are at the bottom of the sea." The former model, Lee Miller, was the only woman to be accredited to go and follow the troops in Normandy. She arrived on the front in mid-June. She wrote a famous article for Vogue magazine called "The Unarmed Warriors," which is still famous. There's a section in the museum at Bayeux, the War Museum that is, dedicated to her. In the article she described with great force what it was like to be in a hospital just behind the front lines and behind Omaha Beach. Another war correspondent who risked all to get to the front was Martha Gellhorn. She was the estranged wife of Ernest Hemingway, the famous author of For Whom the Bell Tolls and The Old Man in the Sea. She wrote for Collier's magazine, but the magazine chose Hemingway to cover the combat instead of her. But she wasn't to be outdone. She stowed away on a ship on the 5th of June, and she disguised herself as a stretcher bearer, so she was in fact the only woman to witness the D-Day invasion firsthand. One fortunate correspondent managed to get his report back before all the others did. A British officer tipped off Ross Munro of the Canadian Press that a destroyer was going back to Britain to pick up General Montgomery. So he managed to get his report back and beat all the others. This carried on his success rate because he was also the first written report of Dieppe and Sicily and Italy. Another correspondent who tried to get his reports back first was Charlie Lynch of the Canadian Press. He took 3 homing pigeons with him, and after witnessing Omaha Beach, he typed up a report 3 times, and he put the report on each of the homing pigeons, let them go, and they flew off towards Berlin. The CBS radio reporter, George Hicks, was on the USS Oncon. Of the 5,000 ships approaching the coast, he said, "You see the ships lying in all directions, just like black shadows on the grey sky. Now planes are going overhead. Hearing fire just now behind us, bombs bursting on the shore and along in the convoys." Then he added, "If you'll excuse me, I'll just take a deep breath for a minute and stop breathing." His report was aired over the radio at 3:30 Greenwich Mean Time, as into the States. The transmission of the broadcast broke down several times. After D-Day, more reports were recorded, because before that, the powers that be thought that a recorded message could be tampered with and a broadcast message couldn't, but the technical difficulties meant that a lot of reports were recorded. ERnie Pyle sent his first report back on the 7th. Due to last-minute alteration in the arrangements, I didn't arrive at the beachhead until the morning after D-Day. After our first wave of assault troops had hit the shore, by the time we got here, the beaches had been taken and the fighting had moved a couple of miles inland. All that remained on the beach was some sniping and artillery fire, and the occasional startling blast of a mine geysering brown sand into the air. That, plus a gigantic and pitiful litter of wreckage along miles of shoreline. Submerged tanks and overturned boats, and burned trucks, and shell-shattered jeeps, and sad little personal belongings were strewn all over the bitter sands. That, plus the bodies of soldiers lying in rows covered in blankets, the toes of their shoes sticking up in a line as though on drill, and other bodies, uncollected, still sprawling grotesquely in the sand or half hidden by the high grass behind the beach. That, plus an intense grim determination of work-weary men to get this chaotic beach organised and get all the vital supplies and the reinforcements moving more rapidly over it from the stacked-up ships standing in droves out to sea. He sent 70 dispatches from Normandy. The last was on the 5th of September from Paris, and then he went to the Pacific front. Now, we've mentioned Ernest Hemingway's estranged wife who went in. On the 5th, Ernest Hemingway boarded a ship and approached the Normandy coast. But unlike Robert Capa, he didn't go ashore. He accompanied the men in a landing craft towards the coast, looking through binoculars. He wrote, "Those of our troops who are not wax grey with seasickness, fighting it off, trying to hold on to themselves before they had to grab for the steel side of the boat, were watching the battleship Texas with a look of surprise and happiness. Under the steel helmets, they looked like pikemen of the Middle Ages, to whose aid in battle had come some strange and unbelievable monster. There would be a flash like a blast furnace from the 14-inch guns of the Texas that would lick far out from the ship. Then the yellow-brown smoke would cloud out, and with smoke rolling, the concussion and report would hit us, jarring the men's helmets. It struck your ear like the punch of a heavy, dry glove." Charlie Lynch wasn't the only one to use homing pigeons to send messages. As there was radio silence, homing pigeons were used to send back messages to England. Gustav, a pigeon, was released, and 5 hours later he'd done 150 miles to Thorney Island in Sussex. He was awarded the PDSA Dickin Medal. That's the equivalent of the Victoria Cross for animals. Walter Kronkite spent so much of his time at Molesworth, he considered it his second home in England. Molesworth is an airbase. Walter Kronkite, he witnessed a bombing raid over the coast from the plastic nose of a B-17 called Shoo Shoo Baby, after one of the Andrew Sisters' songs. As he went across the channel, he noted that there wasn't enough room for any more ships. The most famous journalist must be Robert Capa, who made these famous photos on Omaha Beach. He was the only journalist on Omaha Beach, The story of the photos will be another video. The common story is probably not the truth. Now, General Montgomery installed his headquarters at Creully in the 18th century chateau there. Creully with a T, and that's just across the river from Creully, where there's the 11th century chateau. The BBC used the tower of the chateau to record reports of Normandy. Within 2 weeks, Frank Gillard had actually installed a studio in the tower, and then they could broadcast directly to England. The radio aerial is still there. From the 10th of June, about 50 odd journalists were installed in the grounds of the Vouilly chateau. Every morning at 9 there'd be a press conference with news of how the front was advancing. Their press reports would start with "from somewhere in France," as their whereabouts was secret. Hemingway and Capa were there. Next to the conference room was a room where the censors would be set up, checking all the reports. General Bradley, he had his headquarters camp about a mile away in a field. Being in the battle zone is dangerous for anyone, and journalists can get killed, and they often do. Lee McArdell was with Irvin Bede covering Operation Cobra. That was when some of the 5,000 tons of bombs supposed to be dropped on the Germans fell on the Americans. General McNair was killed in this action. Irvin Bede had been taking lunch near Pont Hubert. Someone shouted, "Watch out, bombs of the marauders are falling short." Everybody started running. McArdell said Irvin had been sitting in his jeep and apparently hesitated a split second to pick up his camera before diving into a nearby ditch. He was caught in mid-air by a bomb fragment and killed instantly. Irvin was found by McArdell with a camera in his hand, and another camera lay next to him. He's buried in the American cemetery as one of the 4 civilians. ERnie Pyle was in Okinawa in 1945. He was travelling in a jeep with Lieutenant Colonel Coolidge. They came under fire. Everybody dived into a ditch. A little later, Coolidge says, I and ERnie Pyle raised up to see what was happening, and there was another burst of machine gun fire. I looked at Ernie and I saw he'd been hit. He'd taken a bullet in the forehead. Robert Capa was covering the Indochina War. That's before it became Vietnam. That was in 1954. He was travelling with French troops through a dangerous area. Capa decided to leave the jeep and go up on some high ground to get a better view of the troops. And he stepped on a mine, so he was killed instantly. It was in 1954. The War Reporter's Memorial is unique in Europe, and it's in Bayeux. It's a landscape path bordered by white stones having the names of over 2,000 journalists killed from 1944. That's when they started counting. The years with no journalists killed stand out from the majority.